We are joined today by Anquillare of PEF Services and Julia Corelli of Pepper Hamilton. Ladies, welcome to Privcap today. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
So we are talking about an important topic in private equity that's getting a lot more attention, which is sort of how expenses are dealt with in the private equity firm and which entity pays for them. And it's come to your attention, or you've long been aware that especially the deal maker side of the firm, which tends to be the founders of the firm and the people driving the business activity, those folks are not often as aware as they should be about how times have changed with regard to expenses. Let's set the stage a bit. What historically has been the practice in private equity firms by way of expenses? Has it been relatively loosey-goosey compared to how it should be now? And sort of how have deal makers gone about doing what they're supposed to do, look for deals, vet them, perform due diligence, and paying for all those services? How has it typically worked?
Well, loosey-goosey might be a way you describe that, for sure. I think it's changed over the last 4 or 5 years because of the introduction of Dodd-Frank, the registration of more advisors, the scrutiny the SEC is putting on things, and now the results of examinations and speeches talking about those things. And you see people having a much more heightened awareness of all the expenses of what they do and how it affects the returns to a limited partner. The returns have always been a focus. There's no doubt. A deal maker will definitely focus on the returns of the fund, and particularly the returns from deals that they do. But there's a growing consciousness of expenses along the way, at the same time as you have a lot of the deal processing becoming quite different. It's much more competitive, and it's more expensive, for sure. So all of those things, confluence of them is to focus on expenses and have to be much more aware and trained within your organization about how they get dealt with.
And from your perspective, what has changed in the market as far as awareness, or at least the need for especially the deal makers to be more aware of how expenses get treated?
There's been a maturing of the industry, and if a fund manager wants to go, we deal with a lot of first-time fund managers or small emerging fund managers. If they want to go from Fund 2 to Fund 3 or Fund 3 to Fund 4, they do need to get an appreciation and be more sophisticated in the conversations with their investors, because their investors will be more sophisticated in their questions.
What are some of the typical expenses that we're talking about, and what where do they start, and through what period of the life cycle do they extend?
So in the beginning, there's fundraising expenses, which involve, to get more granular, travel, meals, with prospective, with existing LPs, with CEOs of portfolio companies, prospective CEOs, people who are going to become portfolio companies. A lot of focus on the travel and entertainment expenses. In addition, you have the normal deal expenses. There's legal, there's accounting, there's consulting, environmental, IP, all the people that you use to put a deal together. Those expenses, people complain, are getting higher these days, and they're getting incurred earlier as the deal process is changing. If you move from a straightforward letter of intent to closing into a deal where there's an auction and letter of intent never comes, and you actually go from auction to definitive documentation, you've front-end loaded a lot of the deal expenses before you know you have a deal. Broken deal expenses have become a high level of scrutiny, and by LPs as well as by the regulators.
And in the mind of, let's say, a deal maker, why shouldn't he or she just say, hey, an expense is an expense, I'll just incur this expense and we'll let the accountants figure it out later?
As a firm manager or GP, you want to be ahead of the problem. So to the extent you take a more laissez-faire attitude, something that's relatively small and could have been addressed sooner can blow up into a problem that could affect the trust of your investors, and certainly could cause a lot of pain and anguish and quality legal time due to an SEC issue.
So in a nutshell, what is the advice to a firm as far as setting up this kind of a culture and kind of a system for getting ahead of how expenses are treated?
Well, number one would be knowing your limited partnership agreement, knowing how you've configured the expenses, and having a say in that LPA as it's being developed, so that you can confer, the deal person, can confer with the CCO and counsel to say, we need these kind of expenses because this is what's happening in the deals that we're seeing. Second, make sure there's a connection, a real connection between what you disclose in your PPM to everything that you can anticipate happening. That's really hard to do, because in the next 10 years, who can say what's going to happen? But if you are talking to everybody in the firm, deal maker, CCO, counsel, accounting group, CFO. All of those people have a say in what expenses should or should not be borne by the fund, and continually educate people.
We're going to walk through a few scenarios, real-life scenarios about situations that GPs might face out in the field by way of expenses. But before we get there, let's talk a bit more about documentation. What does this look like from a GP's perspective?
Expense reporting, obviously done on the firm's form for reporting expenses. There should be a policy and procedure in the compliance manual that addresses what expenses need prior approval and which don't. There should be constant checking by the CCO with the deal people as to whether they're complying with that. If you have expenses being put through which are not consistent with that policy, you have to remediate that and educate and train and document how you've gone to address that. If there's expenses like legal bills, something I'm a little bit familiar with, have your lawyer set it up in a way that it's broken down by them. You give them instruction, break down by them as to what should be charged to the management fee and what should be charged to the fund, because then you're not in the process of highlighting the line entries and saying, well, that's a fund expense and that's a management expense.
First scenario, let's say that there's a private equity firm that's holding an annual meeting at a resort somewhere, and on the same trip to that annual meeting, one of the partners decides to visit a local CEO and take him to dinner in conjunction with a potential deal. So which entity should pay for the annual meeting, the GP management company or the fund? And then for the CEO dinner, which entity should pay for that, or it should be a little bit of both?
The annual meeting typically is a fund expense, although it's interesting the granularity that the SEC and in some cases investors are getting into with regards to what constitutes annual meeting. Is it just the meeting? Is it the dinner before? What about the golf and tennis? So, getting back to Julie's point, you have to have a policy. And we are starting to see the industry continue to evolve in being able to handle this in a more proactive and organized manner. So the CEO, that is part of deal sourcing, which you tend to need a bright line as to when is it just general prospecting versus you've targeted a company and you've started the diligence process.
So it sounds like you're saying in general, taking the CEO to dinner should probably be a separate expense that goes to the management company.
It's hard to generalize, but it also depends on whether the CEO is an existing portfolio company CEO or a target company portfolio CEO, and how far you've gone down the pike to target them. So, and there is a whole continuum of sourcing a deal, getting to know the portfolio company, doing due diligence on it, documenting your deal with it, closing, going forward. So somewhere in that continuum, it shifts from management company to fund.
A GP is accompanying an LP on a due diligence trip. So the LP wants to see how the sausage is made and is coming along on a due diligence trip. The trip requires travel, entertainment expenses, as well as some legal fees. The deal ends up not happening, but the LP was so impressed with the whole process that the LP ends up investing in the next fund.
So the LP was not an LP in the fund that the GP is visiting this portfolio company for in that scenario.
Okay, so that's an important distinction.
I think it is, because it wouldn't be a fund syndication expense of the fund that has the portfolio company. On the other hand, you're marketing the firm, and it's going to benefit Fund 2. I would say that LP's travel expense is not a fund expense, it's a management company expense.
A GP conducts due diligence on a portfolio company up until a letter of intent is signed, but then the firm secures financing for the deal. Who pays the legal fees associated with the financing?
In this scenario, this is actually a third party providing the financing, and you're, as a fund, either paying for that, hopefully getting the portfolio company to pay for it, or it becomes management company expense. So if structured in the best light, you would already have a definitive agreement of some type with the portfolio company so that they would be responsible for reimbursing.
And the deal practice in the world is the portfolio company. If the deal closes, the portfolio company pays it. And if the deal doesn't close and you have an arrangement with the lender, the fund pays it.
And this is one of the common drawbacks in a partnership agreement. You cannot envision all the nuances that are going to happen over the next 10 to 12 years of a fund's life. And what I find interesting is there's some that say, okay, well, these partnership agreements now have to blossom from 50 pages to 500 pages.
Let's talk briefly about the survey that your two firms jointly conducted into, I guess, practices around expenses. It'll be available to anyone who's watching this program, but maybe you can give us an executive summary. What were the most important findings that you think came out of that survey?
Well, it was a tripartite participants, PEI, PEF Services, and Pepper Hamilton, and it came out of a discussion at the CFO-CCO forum last year, and about the lack of granularity, the lack of guidance in the industry at a very fundamental level as to how expenses should be dealt with. And so we came up with a scenario of everything from doing a deal to being examined by regulators and building your firm. So starting with 2 people, adding principals, adding operating partners, et cetera. Came up with a number of questions about those. And then sent it out to 104 participants across growth equity, private equity, real estate, debt, and other. I think the most interesting finding to me was on some of the regulatory expenses, where as you move from routine exam, registration and routine exam, which are pretty, in our survey, pretty standardly the management company expense. I mean, certainly not without exception, though. And as you moved into exam findings and fixing deficiencies and into perhaps something that grew out of it, maybe as a principle, the subject of some investigation, you saw more and more and more of that shifting in the survey answers to the fund. And I'm not sure LPs are really anticipating that that is happening, but I think it does happen.
We had over 100 respondents, typically CFOs, CCOs of these funds, and where some of the tried and true industry practices, there was consistency in the responses, things like dead deal expenses. What came across very clearly is that there was no consensus with regards to the newer issues facing the industry. Regulatory, the new scrutiny. Nobody really talked about annual meetings until about a year ago. So that was all over the lot. And I think it behooves us as an industry to really keep this conversation going, because, the SEC, while they're coming up to speed, they're not as versed in the private capital industry. And there are reasons why we have developed certain practices as an industry.